Many years ago, when I visited this lovely museum in New York City called the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I came across a painting which led to discovering a fascinating story about a person about whom I'll tell you today. This was the painting that I saw there. It was a strange looking man in Indian costumes in the Indian gallery of this museum. And this is the hero of our story, who we'll be talking about. So our story begins in 1548, long ago. Right? Let's look at what the world was during that time. These are some of the primary players in that time in the world. There was King Edward VI in England. Those of you who have read the story Prince and the Pauper will know that this is the prince from that story by Mark Twain. There was King Charles I in Spain. And of course, all the money and the power was in the east. There was Suleiman the Magnificent in Turkey. There was Tahmasp in Iran, controlling the Silk Route at that time. King John III of Portugal had already set sail and had got his people to come to Calicut in India and had set up a Portuguese presence out here. But the bulk of the wealth in the world, almost half of the wealth of the world, was controlled by these two people out here. There was a person who came from Bihar called Sher Shah Suri, who was now ruling in Agra. And there was Jia Chang, the Ming emperor, who was ruling out of China. So this is what the world was in 1548. And these lines that you see here, these were the important trade routes of the day. All on sea, as you can make out. They were all sea routes, going from Surat to all the way to Iran, or going from Calicut all the way to Kenya, or circling around Madagascar, or going from Nagapattinam in the east coast, just on top of Chennai, all the way to Hong Kong, or to the Philippine Islands, and so on. Now, this route is what controlled the world's wealth, and we'll come back to that, remember that. And about half of the world's wealth lay here. Yeah, this is where the trade surpluses were, and this is where basically everybody wanted to trade with. So this is the world in which our hero is born. And you can see he's born in a faraway corner of Ethiopia, not far from where Somalia is today, in a poor little village. He's born with the name Chapu, in a tribe which is called the Oromos. They still exist today. When he was maybe 10 or 12 years old, little Chapu is sold into Yemen to a place called Mocha. Some of you may recognize this name as being the name of a coffee. And you'd be right in thinking that that coffee has something to do with this place in Yemen. In fact, Mocha coffees were from Yemen originally. So Chapu is sold to Mocha for a few pennies at the time as a slave. And from Mocha, he is then sold into Baghdad, which is one of the important cities of the world. A lot of wealth, a lot of influence, a lot of rich people who live there. Now, in Baghdad, he grows up to be a young man. He's converted into Islam, and he is given a name by his master. His name changes from Chapu to Ambar. And Ambar literally means a brave person. And when he's 22 years old, he's then sold again, this time into one of the greatest wealth-creating nations in the world, which is southern India in the Deccan, and a small kingdom called Ahmednagar. So this is what you need to remember about the world that we're talking about. We started off in 1548, and we're now in 1571. The world has changed a little bit. Chapu is born. He's now 22 years old. And the world now is a place where Queen Elizabeth I is in England. Some of you may have seen a movie made on her called Elizabeth. Suleiman the Magnificent has died, giving way to Salim. Tahmasp is still hanging on. Spain and Portugal are being ruled by King Philip II, who in this time has control over a large part of South America and has also got a presence in Asia in the country which is named after him. Any guesses which one? The the Philippines. The Philippines is named after King Philip II. So he's there as well. But the big change that has happened is that Sher Shah Suri is gone, and in place of him is one of the greatest emperors that will rule any part of India in history, which is Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar. The trade routes still remain the same, controlling the world's wealth, and 50% of the world's wealth is still distributed between the Mughal dynasties as well as the Ming Chinese. This is the world in which Malik Ambar arrives. He's a slave actually in the small kingdom of Ahmednagar, which is in present-day Maharashtra. And around him are smaller kingdoms, mid-sized kingdoms of Golconda. Some of you who are from Hyderabad will recognize this name, the Kingdom of Golconda. And what is Karnataka at that time was the Kingdom of Bijapur for the most parts. There were many other kingdoms in South India at that time. There were the Polygars in Tamil Nadu and so on and so forth. There were the Calicut Zamorins who were in the eastern parts, but we're not too much concerned with them at this point. But you'll see that the big part of this picture is dominated by the Mughal dynasty at that time, which is stretching all the way from Afghanistan to the borders of Burma. Now, when Ambar arrives in this world, he's quite fascinated because this is the richest place that he's ever been to. Even though he's a slave himself, he's never seen such wealth before at that time. The 1570s in India was a remarkably prosperous time. And Ahmednagar at that time is ruled by this guy called Murtaza Nizam Shah. He was, by all accounts, a slightly crazy individual, not a great leader. Yeah, but the person who buys Ambar, which he finds to his wonder, is an African man. Like, he's an African himself. Ambar isn't, remember that he's a foreigner. He's come from Ethiopia. He's been sold into Baghdad. He's a African-looking man in a strange country, but he finds that the person who's bought him, and this is not his real picture, is a person called Genghis Khan, who is a minister in the court of Murtaza Nizam Shah. Now, what Ambar finds out very quickly is that the Deccan, or the southern part of India at that time, is filled with Africans. And usually Africans who have come here as slaves and who have then become free to get pretty influential positions and posts in many kingdoms around. These Africans now are, almost royalty. There are people in Golconda, in Hyderabad, in Bijapur, in parts of Kerala, in the northern parts of India. They are speaking Telugu, Kannada, Marathi. Some people speak Farsi. And most of them have forgotten their original mother tongues. But the subcontinent seems to be full of people who look like Ambar. So what do you think goes through Ambar's mind at that time? He starts thinking that this is a place where he has some hope of upward mobility. He can become free and he can become like these people. As time passes, when he's 28 years old, 6 years after he arrives in India, his master, Genghis Khan, dies in battle. And according to the laws of Ahmednagar at that time, Ambar is set free. And this is the world that he inhabits. He becomes a fairly important person in Ahmednagar because in the 6 years that he has worked there, he has done very well. He's become a very able warrior. He's also very smart, so his master has given him a lot of tasks to do with administration. So he's a fairly decently successful slave who's now free. He's not a slave anymore. And he lives here. Now, his big break in his career comes when the ruler of Bijapur at that time, Bijapur is in northern Karnataka, some of you may have visited there. It's a short train ride away from Bangalore, an overnight train ride. You can see many things which were, palaces and things in Bijapur that are really interesting there, but that's a different story. But the queen of Bijapur at that time, when Malik Ambar just became free, was a woman by the name Chand Bibi. She was a remarkable lady, and her story is a whole video in itself. She wanted to fight off this big Mughal barrage from the north of India, and she teamed up with Ambar to fight the Mughals who were coming from up north. That wasn't so successful because Ambar also was pretty young at that time, and Chand Bibi wasn't very well supported by the people around her primarily because she was a woman, and at that time it was very tough for somebody to be a woman and successful in politics and war at the same time. But Chand Bibi did a remarkable job at that. But overall, she eventually died in the process. But what happened in the meantime was that Malik Ambar, because of his friendship with Chand Bibi and the battles that he fought, became a very, very well-known person in the Deccan as an accomplished warrior. Years pass, and now we are at a stage when Ambar is now 57 years old. By this time, he's got a fairly large following of his own in Ahmednagar. He is sort of influencing politics in a big way. But the interesting thing that happens in 1605 is that the king or the emperor of what is by then the wealthiest empire in the world, Akbar, dies. And as it happened many times in the Mughal dynasties, as soon as Akbar died in 1605, his son, a person by the name Salim, who eventually became known as Jehangir, starts fighting a civil war or a battle with his sons, Parvez Mirza and Khusro Mirza. So Parvez Mirza and Khusro Mirza were Akbar's grandsons, Jehangir's sons, and Akbar actually wanted them to become kings after he died. But of course, Jehangir thought differently and quickly started a battle with his own sons soon after his father passed away. Now, while this was going on, while this little civil war was going on in the Mughal side of things, what do you think happened in Ahmednagar? When this was going on and the Mughals were busy fighting themselves, Malik Ambar got a chance to consolidate his power. The first thing he did was he got his daughter married to the king of Ahmednagar, so he became the father-in-law of the king, effectively a very, very powerful man indeed. And he started talking to Bijapur and Golconda and started recruiting armies and his own personal army in that time. So over a period of a few years, and because of his prior successes in battles with the Mughals, he was successful in standing up an army of around 7,000 to 10,000 people. Yeah, this army was very, varied. There were horsemen, there were people who fought on foot, there were people who were gunmen, there were Africans in the army, there were Marathi-speaking people, there were Kannada-speaking people, there were Telugu-speaking people. It was a very diverse and a very interesting army, the likes of which had never happened in the Deccan before. And all these people were fanatically loyal to Malik Ambar because they all liked him as a leader. By this time, he's pretty much the ruler of this little kingdom of Ahmednagar. But good times don't always last. So, while all this was going on, in a few years, Jehangir won his own battles in the Mughal side of things and he became the emperor. Jehangir, of course, means the Lord of the world, Jahan. Yeah? So he becomes the ruler of the Mughal Empire. And almost immediately after becoming king, he sets his sights on the south once again, which his father had wanted to do, couldn't go down south and expand the Mughal kingdom down there. Now, one of the questions you might be thinking is that the Mughals have such a huge empire to begin with. Why were they so interested in these southern kingdoms? These were all smaller kingdoms. Why were the Mughals so hell-bent on getting control of these smaller kingdoms? Now if you thought that, it's a very good question to think about. So you'll notice that this little triangle at the south of India is where the location of an important physical feature is. You might have learned this in your geography lessons. What is the name of this part of India? It's called the Deccan Plateau. That part, the Deccan, actually has, as you can see, two coastlines, which you will notice the northern part of the subcontinent doesn't have. There aren't such great coastlines in the northern parts. You have coastlines in Gujarat and you have some coastlines in Bengal, but these never-ending, large, long places where ships can dock just don't exist in the north. And that's what makes the Deccan so very important to world trade. Because this part of the country, as you can see, lay in the center of those shipping routes that we spoke about. In fact, these places were so important that the wealth of the Mughal Empire was almost equal to the wealth of these small kingdoms in the Deccan. So the Deccan was actually a very rich place at that time. Rich enough for people like Jehangir and folks like that to absolutely have a very good reason to want to invade and control these kingdoms. Time passes again, and in a few years, Ambar is nearly 70 years old, 68 years. The year is 1616. Jehangir is hell-bent on going south. He wants to cross the Vindhyas and come down into Ahmednagar. But he can't do it alone. He knows that Malik Ambar is not a fool. He's done many things to defeat the Mughal dynasty in times past. So what Jehangir does, among other things, is a rather clever thing of teaming up with the king of Bijapur. So he goes ahead and tells Bijapur that, hey, why don't you team up with me? I'm going to go ahead and launch an attack on Ahmednagar. What I want you to do is to support me and not Ambar. So they do that, and in 1624, a few years later, when Ambar is almost 80 years old, 76 years old, many of our grandparents may be around this age at this point in time. Yeah. At that age, there is a decisive battle that sets itself up. In September of 1624, the armies of Ahmednagar, led by Malik Ambar, meet the combined armies of the Mughal and the Bijapur Sultan. The Bijapur Sultan at that time is a guy called Ali Adil Shah, also a very, very fascinating man. Yeah, again, a whole different story about him at some later date. So two big armies, numbering almost 100,000 people, team up against Malik Ambar's 10,000 at a place called Bhatwadi, which is now in Maharashtra, next to a small river called the Keli River. And this is happening in September-October timeframe, where if any of you are from Maharashtra, if any of you have been to Maharashtra during the rainy seasons, will know that it rains non-stop. Very heavy rains at that time. Everything goes green and it's extremely beautiful. So at that time, what Malik Ambar does, he knows that he can't fight Jehangir and Adil Shah just by numbers alone, because, the two armies are about 10 times as big as his own. He goes ahead one night and over a period of time breaks the dams on the Keli River, which has been built before. So there were dams in these rivers to help agriculture and things like that, much like dams are used today. So he goes ahead and breaks all those dams to flood the river. And there's a massive, huge amount of flooding that happens out of the river, which completely dampens and makes a slush out of the entire place where the battle is supposed to happen. And as a result of that, because of this massive floods that Malik Ambar sets off, the huge cavalry of the Mughals and the Adil Shah Sultan, they are rendered useless. Their horses, they're hundreds of thousands of people. And at that time, if you read about or if you understand how battles happened at that time, it wasn't just people going to fight. People used to go to fight with their families, with their shopkeepers. It was a whole village or a whole city which used to travel to have these battles. All of this gets stuck in the mud. And what happens to Malik Ambar? He has light cavalry. They know the roads, they know the lay of the land extremely well. They know how to avoid this flood, and they keep coming every night and attacking the Mughal forces. And over a period of time, the Mughals are driven back. And this was Jehangir's biggest defeat in his career. Yeah, the Bijapur Sultan went back, Jehangir went back, Malik Ambar went home undefeated. And because of that, his stature was such that it just became legend at that point. That this man, from such a small country, defeated this massive empire which was ruling the entire northern Indian plains. This is, the equivalent of, let's say, Sri Lanka defeating India in a battle, or Guatemala defeating the United States in battle, or something like that. Yeah, it was remarkable at that time. What makes it more interesting is that the combined forces of the Mughals and the Bijapur Sultans was led by another African guy called Ikhlas Khan. So you can imagine what a strange situation we are seeing in southern India in the mid-1600s, where one Indian kingdom, the Ahmednagar kingdom, led by this African person from Ethiopia called Malik Ambar, is fighting a combined force of the Mughals and the Bijapuris, led by another African person, who, of course, eventually gets killed by Malik Ambar. But that was what the regional battles and the regional rivalries looked like in those days. Now, this loss was so frustrating to Jehangir that he went back home and had this painting commissioned. Now, this painting is also hanging in the Metropolitan Gallery in New York. Even today, anybody can go and see it. Now, he gets this picture painted of them, of Jehangir himself standing, wearing his royal robes with angels cheering him on, shooting arrows into Malik Ambar's head. Now, this was, of course, his frustration talking, and the fact that he could not defeat this little man, little kingdom, and he got, pictures painted of his fantasies to kill this man because he couldn't do it himself. Some years later, we are looking at 1626. The world is very different now than when we started off. It's almost 80 years later. England is now ruled by King Charles I. If you have your history lessons at some point, you might learn that King Charles I was the only king in England to get beheaded at one point. That's a different story. Turkey is ruled by Murad, Persia is ruled by Shah Abbas, the Mughals are ruled by Jehangir, and as you can see, the Europeans are spreading around the world. This is the world when Malik Ambar dies at almost 80 years old, at 78. Never lost a battle, never lost any territory from his kingdom of Ahmednagar. What an amazing life. Going from Ethiopia, being born there, sold in slavery at about 10 years old, to Yemen, to Baghdad, then from there to Ahmednagar, and from a slave becoming free and almost becoming a king of a small but very wealthy empire, and then being able to defeat what was one of the biggest empires in the world at that time, not once, but many times. So what happens after that? If you go to Ahmednagar today, you can still see Malik Ambar's tomb. You can still see the waterways that he built in Aurangabad. There are many interesting things to see in Aurangabad, but again, these are stories for a different time. But you can still see the stuff that Malik Ambar built and see what a visionary he was more than 450 years ago. After Malik Ambar, you have a situation where Jehangir died, and eventually 2 generations later, Aurangzeb took over pretty much what was left of the southern Deccani sultanates. The Deccan fell to the Mughals, and very soon after that, the Mughals themselves disappeared from the scene. But here's a little interesting tidbit to end this story with. You remember the battle at Bhatwadi, where Malik Ambar defeated the Mughals and the Bijapur Sultanate, where he was the victor? Well, he had 2 of his very good friends fight with him there. These 2 guys was a general in his army, in Malik Ambar's army, called Maloji Bhosle, and Maloji Bhosle's son, called Shahaji Bhosle. These 2 guys were father and son fighting side by side with Malik Ambar, learning from his battle tactics, and were very, very loyal to him. In fact, they were so loyal that some of Maloji Bhosle's grandchildren, which we'll speak about in a minute, wrote about Malik Ambar in very glowing terms later. Now, who was Maloji Bhosle's grandson and Shahaji Bhosle's son? Maloji Bhosle's grandson was none other than the person who you might know, called Shivaji. So Shivaji's grandfather was actually a friend of Malik Ambar, and Malik Ambar's battle tactics, which were at that time called Bargigiri, were perfected by Shivaji 2 generations, almost 70 years later, to fight with Jehangir's grandson, Aurangzeb, right? And Shivaji, of course, chipped away at the Mughal Empire bit by bit, formed his own dynasty, and went ahead and laid the stage for a very different part of Indian history which was to come. And in fact, Shivaji's biography mentions Malik Ambar multiple times. He writes about Malik Ambar being as glorious as the sun in Sanskrit. And he also writes about how Shahaji helped Malik Ambar in battle. 130 years later, after Shivaji's death, the Marathas pretty much had the whole of the country for a very short time. But all of this was made possible by the fact of Malik Ambar's presence in the Deccan and how he changed battle tactics across the region, how he basically set the stage for a north versus south, many clashes between the northern kingdoms and the southern kingdoms, and gave somebody like Shivaji a tactic to go ahead and eventually fight and win against the Mughal Empire. So that's the story of this guy, guys. Malik Ambar. Yeah? Started off as a slave, became a kingmaker, almost a king himself, but set in stage things that eventually led to India becoming what it is today. Hope you enjoyed the story.